Hey there, everyone. My name's Steve Bonds, and I want to welcome you to my professional development session today. It's on copyright, what teachers need to know. So before we get going, I'm going to go ahead and introduce myself. Again, my name's Steve Bonds, and I teach engineering and mathematics courses at Bentonville West High School. Now, one other little thing that might surprise you all is that before I became a teacher, I was a newspaper reporter, so I know a little bit about copyright and media law because I took those courses in college. So I'm going to bring some of that experience with me as well. I was one of those people that never could decide what they wanted to be when they grew up. I enjoyed math and science just as much as I did writing, and so eventually that led to becoming a math and engineering teacher. But I strongly believe that communication is key, no matter what profession you're in. So it all worked out. So just a little bit more about me. Here's an example of some of the articles that I wrote back when I was a newspaper reporter. I covered a lot of education, some things about technology, covered a lot of Walmart stories. I wrote for the Benton County Daily Record, as well as the Northwest Arkansas Times in Fayetteville. So covered a lot in the Northwest Arkansas region. Today, we're going to go ahead and get going on this. We're going to talk about 4 primary topics, just copyright in general, public domain, fair use, something I'm very familiar with as a newspaper reporter, and a former newspaper reporter, and Creative Commons. So we'll start with just copyright in general. I'm starting with this quote by Mark Twain. Only one thing is impossible for God, to find any sense in any copyright law on the planet. So there is a lot of gray area in copyright. We'll talk more about that as this presentation continues, and especially when we get into fair use. It's something that can be a little tricky. So we'll, even courts have been kind of hung on certain issues when it comes to that, but we'll talk more about that in a minute. So if you own a copyright, you have 6 rights as a copyright: any intellectual property, any written property, artistic expression, that sort of thing. You have the right to reproduction. That's something that teachers definitely need to be aware of because a lot of times we reproduce work and making copies, things like that. We want to be very aware of what the law says about that. Adaptation. So whenever you take a work that's owned by somebody else and, like, say, do a film adaptation, if it's from a novel, that sort of thing, that's what adaptation covers. Distribution. So how it's distributed, obviously. Public performance. Again, that's something that teachers need to be very aware of. How do you define public performance? Generally speaking, anything that's shown in a school would be defined as public performance. If it's something that you show in your home, then that's a little bit more private, depending on how many people are watching and who all's involved. Public display and digital transmission of sound recordings. That's something relatively new that's come up in the internet age, but it's definitely something we all need to be aware of. So how do you get a copyright? Again, this is something that teachers may be curious about because we do create a lot of our own work. So copyright can be something that you have written on paper, it's painted on a canvas, it's saved to disk, it's recorded on tape or another medium, exposed on film, and anything that can be put through any other method that creates a permanent record of its creation. So let's continue on talking about how you can get a copyright. Now, even though copyright is basically automatic once that you create a work, but in order to protect yourself, you must register your work if you wish to bring about a lawsuit for infringement of a U.S. work, and that's according to the U.S. Copyright Office. So yes, once you create something that's your own work, technically it's copyrighted. But if you want to protect yourself and be able to sue, it's best to have your work registered with the U.S. Copyright Office. So again, this is kind of where teachers fall in all this. We want to use our own creations, and we need to protect those whenever we write lesson plans, come up with activities, but also we want to use other creations in our classroom. So again, teachers kind of fall in the middle here. If this were a Venn diagram, we're caught right in the middle there. So another thing that we need to be aware of when it comes to copywriting our own work, there's something called work for hire. It adds an extra variable for teacher-created content. Are your creations a part of the job you were hired for? So one thing as a newspaper reporter, obviously, I don't have copyright on the articles that I wrote when I was a reporter because that was part of my job. In fact, I even have to pay to look up those articles that I showed you a second ago on the Northwest Arkansas Times, Benton County Daily Record. It's all part of the Democrat Gazette now. But I have to pay to look up those articles that I wrote, and I don't own the copyright on them because that was work for hire. Another thing that came up for me recently, and I began to reflect on it when researching this for my professional development presentation that I'm giving now, is a project I did last summer where I did this program called Teach Engineering. I spent weeks and weeks creating a pages long, 20 pages long project for on exploring data and analyzing data using an original idea and an original lesson plan. And ultimately, it was supposed to be distributed on this Teach Engineering website, which is a free resource. But whenever you read the fine print, it says once you publish it there, you have given away basically your copyright to Teach Engineering, and you no longer own the copyright to that. So that's something that after spending weeks and weeks, working on and trying to come up with something creative and original, it was a little disheartening to find out that I wouldn't own the copyright once I published it on Teach Engineering. Now, I did get paid a stipend for working on this, but if this becomes a very popular activity and it's spread about throughout the nation, then I would be losing, theoretically, potentially, a lot of money on that. So, these are things that we need to consider as teachers when we're putting in a lot of time and effort into creating our lesson plans. So that basically covers the, the gist of copyright and what all it covers. Now we're going to talk about things that teachers need to be aware of that they can use without permission, things that are in the public domain. They're not copyrighted. So works that are not protected by copyright. Things like facts are not protected by copyright. Dates of historical events, accounts of historical events, maps, things like that, phone book, ages of people, things like that. Facts are not protected by copyright. You're free to use those however much you want in your classroom. Works not created by humans are not copyrighted. So, if you see a great work of art that was created by primates or anything like that, that's not covered by copyright. Works created by the U.S. federal government, again, that's kind of like a work for hire thing. We pay them to come up with these sorts of things like legislation, bills, things like that. Works no longer under copyright protection. Like works published for right now, it's works generally published before January 1st, 1924, and other scenarios like that. So again, if these things are not under copyright, you're free to use them however much you want in any way that you want. Now we're going to get into something that I'm very familiar with as a former writer, fair use. Back when I was in college, when you're young and you have these crazy ideas, I wanted to be a music critic for Rolling Stone magazine. Now, criticism falls under the fair use category, and we'll get more into that right now. So fair use is defined as provisions in the copyright law that give users conditional permission to use or reproduce certain copyrighted works. Give me just a second. I need to pause just a minute. Okay. I'm going to go back. Sorry about that. So I'm going to start again on this slide. Okay, so provisions in the copyright law that give users conditional permission to use or reproduce certain copyrighted works. Some examples include criticism, like I was talking about a second ago. Comment, if you're commenting on a work of art, something like that. News reporting, again, something related to my previous career. Teaching, that's something that we can all relate to. Scholarship, studying, that sort of thing. Now, just because you're using copyrighted materials for these purposes doesn't mean you're covered under fair use. So research is another thing. We'll talk more about that right now. You have a 4-factor test for fair use. What is the purpose and character of the use? Again, it goes back to those. Are you using it for educational purposes, criticism, that sort of thing? What is the nature of the copyrighted material? Is it accounts that came from a newspaper article? Is it unpublished work, which actually is protected even more than published works? The amount copied, what percent are you using? That plays a big role. And the effect on the market of the original. Honestly, this one probably plays one of the biggest roles in this, because is your use going to affect the creator's ability to make income from the work that they produced on their own? If it's not going to make any difference at all, then you're pretty well covered under fair use, but you also have to check out the other 3 factors and make sure that you're in line with those as well. So here are some examples of fair use. Like when I was in college and I was writing reviews for music releases and music films, I did reviews of all of these different albums and DVDs and things like that. And I didn't use, any more than, in fact, back then it was all on paper, so I didn't use any of the actual recordings. I would quote some lyrics and I would comment on those lyrics, but I certainly didn't use any more than 10%, which is generally a rule of thumb that we can follow. Like what percent of the work are you using, like the amount used. I did use the album covers, but again, nobody is going to, like, generally speaking, you're not going to take, especially if it's a black and white reproduction, that's not going to stop somebody from wanting to buy the actual album. So I'm not really affecting the market sale of that. And especially if it's on like a piece of newspaper or something like that, which back in those days it wasn't all digital. So now here's another example of fair use that I wanted to bring up. So one of my favorite TV shows, it's called Flight of the Conchords, and it's basically a musical parody group, although they're different than Weird Al in that they don't use the same melodies and things like that and just change the words. They write their own songs basically in the style of somebody else or in the style of a particular genre. Like over here, they were doing like 80s synth pop, the song called Inner City Pressure. It was basically parodying groups like, say the Pet Shop Boys or Depeche Mode or somebody like that from the 80s. So they wrote songs in the same style, and they did the Vacant Stairs like people did in the music videos back in the 80s, those, gothic kind of bands. But it was their own use. And that's kind of like, there is a caveat to the first factor. What's the nature of the use? It was transformative. It was taking something that may have been thought of in one way and then transforming it completely into a different expression. And here it was basically for comedy purposes. So that, was basically became an original work. And again, they weren't using the original work. They were just using a similar style. like down here, they did the same thing like with groups like the Pet Shop Boy. I'm sorry, like the Beastie Boys, different boys. So like it was in the same style of like the Beastie Boys, but it was completely original music. Now on the same show, their manager down here, Murray, met this new group that he could make a whole lot more money off of, and they were doing like one of those one-hit wonder dance songs, and it happened to be like basically a straight cover of this Polish song, obscure Polish song that they wrote, that basically just translated the lyrics into English. And, he had made millions off of it. He said it was, quote, a cover version. The Polish one was a cover version that came out 13 years prior to their version. Well, copyright law doesn't work that way. Obviously, the Polish version was the original version, and he ended up losing all of his money and that sort of thing. But it's kind of funny that they covered the same thing on their show, basically talking about copyright and the lines that were crossed there. So getting back to something that teachers need to be very aware of, like when can you make copies for your classroom? Making student copies is permissible if certain tests are met. You have to include a notice of copyright. You can't just use, I happen to love correction tape because I've taught a lot of math, but you can't just, put correction tape over the copyright notice and that sort of thing. You've got to include that. Make it brief, generally 10% of the whole, unless it's something like a poem, like I was talking about earlier, that 10% rule. Spontaneity, like, is it something kind of last minute? It's like, oh, I need copies for my class, not something that's planned in advance where your administrator says, okay, you need to make these copies next year, even though it's copyrighted material. It needs to be something more spontaneous than that. And the cumulative effect. Over time, it can't replace textbooks. You still need to buy those textbooks. It can't be replacing something long-term, basically. You need to be aware of licensures issues. Things like teachers pay teachers. That's something that has been an issue in the past in my school, is that you need to make sure you have the number of licenses that you need for every teacher, and make sure you follow the licensing guidelines. You can't just buy one license and expect your entire school to be using that curriculum. You need to follow the guidelines given in the license. So you're only making copies for your students, not the entire department students. One other thing, the last thing I want to talk about here is Creative Commons. Creative Commons is an online resource that provides materials without having to pay royalties. It basically promotes scholarship by offering these materials online. So where can you find these materials? You can find them in Wikipedia, Wikimedia, Flickr, SoundCloud. This list right here basically kind of shows you where you can find these materials. And they have different licenses that you can use. One, you can use it by attribution. You can use it for free, but you just need to credit the name of the creator. Then you have what's called, it kind of has combinations of different things. So you can copy, distribute, display, perform, and remix your work if they credit your name and they request it. Then there's also another layer here where you can't make derivative works off of it. If you state that you don't want any derivative works made from it, you can put that in your license as well. You can only copy it verbatim. You can't add anything to it, take anything away from it. Then there's the share alike layer, where others can distribute your work only under a license identical to the one that you originally gave. And then non-commercial, it can only be used for non-commercial reasons. So here's the Creative Commons different layers of licensure. So by attribution, by share alike, by non-commercial, et cetera, et cetera. So you can see these different layers and combinations. It's kind of like permutations and combinations in math. But here are the different ways you can use materials on Creative Commons that you find on Creative Commons. So that's just a general overview of copyrighted materials and how they affect teachers and what you need to be aware of. If you have any questions, you can email me at rbonds@bentonvillek12.org, and I would be happy to answer any of those questions. I hope this has been informative for you, and I hope that you have learned a lot. And again, contact me if you have any questions. And here are the works that I've cited throughout my presentation. And I will share this presentation with you so you can take a closer look at it if you need to review some things here. All right. I hope you all have a great day. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.